Actually, my father came to Canada when I was 3 months old. Yes.
From Taiwan?
From Taiwan. So both my father and my mother got scholarships to go to different universities. My father got a scholarship at McGill University, and my mother got a scholarship at Queen's University. But at the time, they had tried very hard to get to have a baby, and from what my mother's told me was that they weren't having much success. So,
you're the first one?
and only one.
Only one?
Yeah. So when my mother did finally get pregnant, it was also around a time when they got news that they got the scholarships to come to Canada. And so my mother decided that since they had been trying so hard to have a baby, that she didn't want to have an abortion and then try to start over again. She decided that she was going to stay in Taiwan until I grew up a bit. Because one of the other things that at the time was what my mother told me was that on an airplane, pregnant women were not allowed to be on airplanes at that time. So she couldn't fly. Okay, my mother and I didn't come until I was just over 4 years old. So it was in the fall after my 4th birthday that I came to Canada. And at that time, we landed in Vancouver, and my father picked us up in Vancouver, and from there we flew to Montreal. From the age of 4 years old to the age of 16 years old.
Wow.
So most of my childhood was in Montreal, and very fond memories of Montreal.
So you're able to speak French?
Je parle un peu de français, mais mon français n'est pas c'est bon, because in Montreal at the time, and it's still a little bit the same today in Montreal, there is predominantly English neighborhoods in Montreal and predominantly French neighborhoods in Montreal. And all the time that I grew up in Montreal, I lived in predominantly English neighborhoods. So on a day-to-day basis, I never had to speak French. The only time I actually had to speak French was on occasions when I would go to downtown downtown Montreal. And even going to downtown Montreal, it wasn't like I had to speak French all the time in downtown Montreal. It was just sometimes some people who couldn't speak English, I would try to speak French with them. But for the vast majority of the time, even going to downtown Montreal, I could speak English. And in my neighborhood where I lived, everybody spoke English. Even all those years living in Montreal, there wasn't really a lot of opportunity that forced me to speak French. Among my parents' friends, they had children, and my parents' friends' children were my close friends growing up, so they were Chinese. But in school, most of my friends were not Chinese. I only had one Chinese friend that's in school, and that was in high school. I realized, so as far as lonely, I don't think so, but I do think that one of the things I did not realize at the time, but only looking back many years later, is that I was disconnected with the Chinese culture. Our family had Chinese friends, but you're not living in a Chinese society and a Chinese culture. In 2019, so it was just happened to be during Christmas, New Year time, when both my son Sam and I were taking our Christmas holidays. I had promised my Aunt Ruby earlier in the year that I would see her before the end of the year, and I brought my son with me. For me, it was 30 years since I had seen China, so it's been a long time. And for my son, it was the very first time. He doesn't have much of before going to China, he didn't really see much of my side of the family because the vast majority of my family lives in China. I do have some relatives in the United States, but the vast majority are in China, which he has never seen. And to be honest, after 30 years, a large percentage of the population of my family I had never seen before, because I did not know that I was even a granduncle. So there were so many families that I hadn't seen in a long time, 30 years, but also so many family members in which I hadn't just simply never met before. I was treated, both Sam and I were treated wonderfully, both in Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Huzhou. We had family in all these cities, and they just came out to meet us. Trying to keep track of all my family members was a little bit difficult, but one of my uncles was kind enough to write down a family tree that listed, at least on my father's side, all the family on my father's side. For Sam, it was a large awakening for him because he didn't realize that he had so much family, not just here in Canada and some in the United States, but so much family back in China as well, and that was an eye-opener for him. Regarding China, I hadn't seen China in 30 years, and it was quite an awakening for me because China has modernized so much. And we think of cities in North America, such as here in Toronto, or large cities such as New York or Los Angeles to be modern cities. But if you try to compare those cities to cities like Shanghai, Hangzhou, that these cities actually are much more modern than any city you'll find in North America, simply because most of the infrastructure in these large cities were built at least within the last 30 years, if not the last 20 years. So everything is brand new or almost brand new. We're here in Toronto, you have things like subways that have been around for a long, long time and shows their age. I do appreciate how modern the subway system is in Shanghai. Much, if any, Chinese. I had no problems navigating the subway system in Shanghai, and actually I prefer to use the subway system than taxis or anything like that. Of course, I had relatives on occasions that would drive us around, but if it was just on our own, Sam and I, we would take the subway. Not only because the subway system in Shanghai could basically take you to anywhere you wanted to go. It was inexpensive, it was easy to understand, and even on the subway itself, to tell you what the next stop is, was made traveling along on the subway just so much easier. The other thing that I found in Shanghai was how commercial it was. And Sam noticed it as well, where the shopping malls in Shanghai were modern, commercial, and lots and lots of luxury brands that you can find in the Shanghai shopping malls. And we're going, oh, where does all this money come from? Because even when you look at the cars around, and my first stop was, of course, landing in the international airport in Shanghai and meeting some of my relatives, and they took me down into the parking lot in the Shanghai International Airport, and lots of luxury brand, mainly European luxury brand cars you could find in the parking lot there. And I commented on that and they said, well, yes, these are all well-renowned foreign brands, but they're actually Chinese cars because they're all manufactured in China. I did find that there was only one part of Shanghai that I still remembered, and it only vaguely looked familiar, and that's the Bund. The Bund still remains relatively the same as I remembered it 30 years ago. Of course, everything around the Bund is modern buildings, where 30 years ago, even though the Bund was impressive, it was getting old. It wasn't as kept up as well as the Bund now, and they basically refurbished it. So it still has the old feel, but it still has been cleaned up and looks shiny. It's old but shiny. The other part of it that I think that is completely brand new is across the river from the Bund is the financial district. And all those skyscrapers there, I don't remember seeing that at all 30 years ago.
30 years ago.
And two of the tallest buildings, the financial buildings, is actually across the street from the Bund. And I went up the second tallest one, and that was impressive. But I think the highlight of my trip to Shanghai was really to take the river cruise along the river in Shanghai. I did, some of my relatives, even though they live in Shanghai, they live in the outskirts of Shanghai. And in the outskirts of Shanghai, I think things have not changed as much as downtown or the central part of Shanghai. That the pace of change has been slower in the outskirts than in the center. But one of the things that, at least that I noticed, was especially in large cities such as Shanghai, Hangzhou, how fashionable people are, and how fashionable and how impeccable and meticulous people wear their clothes.
And the food?
The food was excellent. always excellent, but a lot more fast food restaurants now than I saw 30 years ago. And one of my relatives, before I said that, oh, you must try the KFC, the Kentucky Fried Chicken in China, because the chicken tastes better. The KFC chicken tastes better in China than it does in North America. And you know, he's right. It does taste better in China than in North America. So
I think they add some local flavor.
Maybe they add some local flavor.
Yeah. Make it more tasteful.
My relatives did encourage my Sam to learn some more Chinese. He attempted a little bit, but I think since coming back to Canada, his effort to learn Chinese has kind of dropped off.
Oh.
But on the other hand, for me, I find that my experience going to China has actually reinvigorated my interest in learning the language.
So when you are very young, so you grew up in Montreal, then at that time your parents brought you back to China once?
My parents brought me back to China, I think 1979.
79.
So 40 years ago. Or just over 40 years ago.
It's a huge difference.
You know, between 1979 and 1989, I did not see
Much difference.
I did not see that 10-year span. I did not see much difference. But that 30 years between 1989 and 2019, huge amount of difference.
Yeah, I think because China joined the WTO in 21st century, is how they develop so fast.
They develop so fast.
Yeah,
yes.
after they open up.
For people who think of China as a developing country, I mean, what I've been told is that major cities like Shanghai, Hangzhou, Guangzhou are extremely modern. But then there are other parts of Shanghai other parts of China that are less developed than some of these major cities. But I've still yet to see it, so I look forward to seeing those other parts.
Yeah, I think compared to 20 years ago, it's still developed a lot, even for the smaller city. Because lots of people now, they do not use that much credit card, debit card, they just use WeChat.
Yes.
WeChat Pay, or Alipay, to scan.
Which is
Code.
very convenient
Yeah.
for my relatives because even when they were paying for some small payments like paying for parking, they would use Alipay or WePay to do that. But it's actually I found it's very difficult for a foreign tourist because credit cards, unless you go to a restaurant or a big restaurant or a big hotel, typically credit cards are not accepted, and most times you can't use a credit card. So unless I have cash and I'm carrying lots of cash with me, it's difficult for me to pay for it, especially because they were treating me to meals and I wanted to repay them, but it was very difficult for me to repay them because in most cases I couldn't use my credit card. And I had heard about WePay and Alipay before leaving China, and I heard about this situation, how popular it is. So I actually wanted to get a WePay or Alipay account, but I couldn't. You can only open up an account in mainland China to get an Alipay or WePay account. The other thing that I thought that my relatives told me was that getting a cell phone account used to be very easy, but just recently as in 2019, that it became much more difficult. So, for example, when I landed in Shanghai International Airport, the first thing I wanted to do was contact my relatives, since I didn't have a Chinese SIM card. Couldn't do that, and also I couldn't use the Wi-Fi either, because the Wi-Fi, for some reason, you have to be registered with a Chinese phone number to be able to use the Wi-Fi. But of course, as a foreigner landing there, I have none of these. So I had difficulty getting in contact with my relatives who were waiting for me in the airport, because they were trying to contact me and I was trying to contact them. but there was no ability to do so until I got through customs and they were waiting for me on the other side. But while I was on one side of custom and they were on the other, there was no means for me to communicate with them.